Okay, no worries. Thanks, Yoko. So, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the TESS seminar for today. And it gives me a lot of pleasure to be introducing our speaker, Jack, because I first got to know him when he did my soil subject in his undergraduate degree back in 2009 or 10 or thereabouts. I couldn't look, anyway, a long time ago. So I don't want to embarrass him with stories about the distant past, but there's one that often gives me a smile, so I'm going to mention it. Once back in that time, I got a call from my tutor in the Townsville class where Jack was studying at the time, and she was agonising over some marking. She's a very highly experienced person and really good teacher, and she was wondering, she said, I've got this essay, and according to all my criteria, it comes out as 100%, but I've never given 100% before. Are we allowed to give 100%? Anyway, that was Jack's essay, and I think he's probably still the only one to have ever got 100% in an essay in any of my subjects. Sorry, student, but it's something to aspire to. So he went on to do honours with me, and I was really impressed by his capacity to work really hard and solve problems and rigorous mind and a really good ability to get on with people. So that was a very successful project, and I really enjoyed working with him then. And after that, he went to work for the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research as a graduate officer for a few years, and he got a lot of experience of a range of disciplines and countries. And one of the great things he did there, I think everyone thinks, was that establishing a really successful networking group for early career researchers in international agricultural research, which continues now. So he went on to do a PhD at the University of Sunshine Coast, and that's where he started his work on gullies, on understanding and quantifying processes involved. And after his PhD, he continued and broadened that research, working with USC and CSIRO. And then last year, we were very fortunate to recruit him into our academic group. So now, on top of all his excellent research, he's also quickly becoming a highly appreciated lecturer in environmental earth science subjects. So, Jack, thanks very much for giving us the seminar, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Can you all hear me okay?
I can.
All good, great. So thank you for that, Paul. I didn't want to blush right at the start of my talk, but yeah, you successfully achieved that. Before I begin today, I did want to just acknowledge the traditional owners and elders, both past and present, of the lands on which we're meeting today. In Townsville, that's the Bindal and Wulgarukaba peoples, and in Cairns, that's the Jabakai, Irukandji, and Gumaya Yidinji peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the some 16 different traditional owner groups located within the Burdekin River catchment, which is where most of the work that I'll present today is actually based. I thought I would start my talk today by showing this photo of an alluvial gully system. I took this photo, or was part of this photo. It's taken quite close to the Burdekin River near Charters Towers, which is just west of Townsville. And I think it just really demonstrates the severity and significance of soil erosion in some of these catchments draining to the Great Barrier Reef. A sediment generated from this particular system will be fed directly into the Burdekin River, and some of that sediment will travel the some 320 odd kilometres downstream, where it'll discharge into the GBR lagoon. And it's there, as we know, where it can have some major impacts on the health of various marine ecosystems within the GBR. It seems like this, as an earth environmental scientist, that both excite me and also keep me up at night. Now, I often wonder, what did this landscape look like before European settlement and before the introduction of livestock in the early to mid 1800s? And, you know, to what extent are modern day land management practices really exacerbating the soil erosion processes that naturally occur in these landscapes? I also often scratch my head about what on earth can be done to actually rehabilitate or remediate a landscape just like this one, and what do we need to do to prevent this type of erosion happening elsewhere in the catchment. So I unfortunately don't have all those answers, and I won't be giving those answers today, but I am heartened by the fact that right across the GBR, there's teams of scientists working in collaboration with traditional owners, with catchment management organisations and landholders to try and answer some of these really complex and complicated problems. In my talk today, I'm going to present some of the work that I've been involved with, which is broadly focused on understanding some of the linkages between cattle grazing in these landscapes, gully erosion processes, and the impacts of these gully erosion on water quality in the Great Barra Reef catchments, with an ultimate view to how we can think about land management and design optimal land management strategies in the region. So before I get into the more technical aspects of the talk, I'll just provide a bit more of the broader context, which I'm sure most people in the audience would be already well aware of. But I think we'd all agree that we're really lucky to have just on our doorstep a really spectacular marine ecosystem, being the Great Barra Reef, which stretches for over 2,300 kilometres along the East Australian coastline. As you can imagine, the reef is home to some really spectacular marine organisms and ecosystems, and it's universally acknowledged as having outstanding ecological value. And locally, it's also really important from a cultural perspective and also from an economic perspective. Unfortunately, as I'm sure many of us would be aware, the health of many of the key marine ecosystems within the reef are facing some major challenges. So along with the effects of climate change, one of the key issues for the reef is poor coastal water quality. And this is largely associated with agricultural activities that are going on in the adjacent catchments. So intensive crop production, primarily sugarcane and bananas, along what is a relatively thin coastal plain, is providing the primary source of dissolved and inorganic nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as herbicides and pesticides out to the reef. Whereas in contrast, soil erosion on savanna rangelands just like this one, further up in the catchments, is providing the primary source of sediments and particulate nutrients out to the reef. These rangelands take up about 75% of the total reef catchment area, which spans about 423,000 square kilometres. So it's a huge area that we're talking about. And within that area, gully erosion has been identified as a primary erosional process, generating a lot of that sediment that's eventually delivered out to the reef. And across these catchments, or across these savanna rangelands, there's about 87,000 kilometres of gully erosion features. So it truly is a major land management challenge. Now, remediating and trying to prevent further degradation of these landscapes has really become a major focus for investment to try and improve coastal water quality in the region. So already there's been about $600 million spent on different trying to improve land management strategies in the region, and there's another $200 million in the pipeline. So it really is critical that we work out what land management strategies are most effective at improving, in terms of improving water quality in the region. Okay, so with all that context in mind, over the past few years, I've been lucky enough to work on and be involved in several different projects, which all broadly have a focus of designing optimal land management strategies and evaluating the effect of different land management practices on gully erosion in the region. So to illustrate some of the work in this space, today I'm going to present three main case studies. The first case study, we're going to look at a long-term study on the effect of reduced grazing pressure on water quality in some ephemeral headwater catchments which drain out to the Great Barrier Reef. In the second case study, we're going to look at another relatively long-term study over an 8-year period where we try to quantify the effect of some relatively low-cost gully rehabilitation measures on sediment yields and vegetation recovery in some of these landscapes. And in the final case study, I'm going to demonstrate how we can generate high-resolution topographic and landscape information using low-cost drones and handheld digital cameras. How we can use this information to then map fine-scale hydrological connectivity patterns and pathways in these landscapes, and ultimately how all of this information can be used to inform land management and gully rehabilitation strategies. Okay, so let's jump into the first case study, looking at the effects of reduced grazing pressure on water quality. So across the GBR catchments, one of the most commonly implemented management strategies to try and improve water quality is to reduce grazing pressure, with the assumption being that a reduction in grazing pressure will lead to an increase in ground cover, which will ultimately lead to a reduction in runoff and erosion, and therefore hopefully reduce sediment yields and improve water quality in the streams draining these catchments. Now, unfortunately, there's actually very limited data available to test these assumptions. And one of the reasons for this is because in the GBR catchments, most monitoring of river loads and water quality occurs at the quite large catchment or even basin scale. And as you can imagine, when we're talking about hundreds to thousands of square kilometers, we're getting some really complicated interactions going on between different land uses. So it's quite difficult to untangle the effect of any one change in a particular land management practice on water quality in the region. It's also complicated by the fact that we have quite diverse soil types, and particularly because we have a really highly variable climate that drives a lot of the erosional processes going on in these catchments. So really, in order for us to untangle some of these complex interactions, it's quite important that we have some long-term data sets taken from smaller property scales, say at the individual property scale, and look at these over quite long time frames. So that brings me to this first case study. So in this study, I worked with the CSIRO to analyze a 20-year record of rainfall, runoff, and water quality that had been collected from 3 small headwater catchments within the Upper Burdekin. Now, all of these catchments had been exposed to, or all have similar climate and landform characteristics, but have actually been exposed to different grazing pressures over the past 20 years or so. So all of the catchments were grazed between the mid-1800s and the year 2000. In one of the catchments, Main Creek, that was acquired by the Department of Defence in the mid-1990s and has had almost complete cattle exclusion since the year 2000. So this is really representing the most extreme sort of case of what happens when you take all cattle off the landscape. In contrast, in the nearby Weenie Creek catchment, here the landholders have implemented a series of what would be considered best practice land management strategies. So they've reduced cattle grazing pressure from on average about 25 head per kilometre squared down to about 13 head per kilometre squared, and also implemented some different pasture strategies. So trying to match the carrying capacity of the landscape to the herd size, as well as wet season spelling and a few other measures. So that's really representing improved or what would be considered best practice. And finally, in the Wheel Creek catchment, there's been no change in management, and it continues to experience relatively high cattle stocking rates of about 25 head per kilometre squared. So this is a really unique data set, both in the context of the GBR and also internationally, where there's actually very few long-term studies of the response in terms of water quality to changes in land management in these semi-arid rangeland landscapes. And it allowed us to really evaluate the question of does reductions in grazing pressure lead to an improvement in water quality, or put more simply, do less cows equal improved water quality? So what did we find? Well, firstly, at the annual timescale, we found the Main Creek catchment to have typically lower annual rainfall runoff ratios, fewer runoff events, and lower annual sediment and nutrient concentrations and loads. So Main Creek catchment is the catchment where all the cattle were removed since the year 2000. To illustrate this graph is showing annual suspended sediment load along the y-axis, time along the bottom axis, and annual runoff along the top axis. And you can see that in most years of the record, particularly since this middle wet period, which was a period of above average rainfall, the Main Creek catchment has typically lower suspended sediment loads relative to the 2 grazed catchments. Further, in 2 of the last 5 years of the record, the Main Creek catchment actually experienced no runoff and therefore no sediment loads, despite receiving similar annual rainfall to the other catchments. So this and a range of other factors that I don't have time to go into today, but was really suggesting that the main creek catchment, that the reduction in grazing pressure in the main creek catchment, coupled with what is a historically lower grazing pressure, may have helped to facilitate increased infiltration capacity in the soil and greater soil surface protection, and also soil water storage capacity that has ultimately helped to reduce the amount of runoff being generated and therefore the amount of erosion occurring. Okay, so that's the main creek catchment. How about the Weenie Creek catchment, where the landholders have implemented these best practice or improved land management strategies? Here, somewhat surprisingly, we did not see a clear reduction in sediment and nutrient concentrations or loads. And these are actually similar in magnitude to what was being monitored at the Wheel Creek catchment, where there was no change in management. So why might this be the case? Well, as you may have guessed, in these catchments, there's a really high density of gullies. And we know that these gullies are still actively eroding today. So while we might expect a reduction in grazing pressure to reduce the amount of runoff entering these gullies and therefore fueling that gully extension, our analysis and our data really shows that lots of runoff is still being generated in these landscapes, particularly during the really large and intense rainfall events. And this is fueling that active gully extension. So in order for us to switch off this important sediment source, it's likely that we're going to need to undertake some more active remediation measures to actually get in the gullies and undertake remediation there. More passive strategies, such as just simply reducing grazing pressure, are likely not going to be sufficient to cut off this sediment source. Now, in addition to the presence of gullies in these catchments, it's also really important to consider the actual composition of vegetation. So in the main creek catchment, we have a dominance of primarily native perennial tussock grasses. And these grasses are known to generally offer greater soil surface protection. They've got more biomass and also promote more soil infiltration than the exotic Indian couch that's really prevalent in a lot of the rangeland landscapes throughout the region. And finally, I guess it's important to note that in these catchments, in many regions, but in many parts of the landscape, particularly around gullies, we've already lost that A horizon, that fertile topsoil. And once we've lost that, we know it's really difficult to get any sort of recovery in soil hydrological function. Okay, so just quickly, a few other interesting findings to come out of this work. We found that most of this total sediment and nutrient load is derived from a small number of relatively large runoff events. So across the entire study period, runoff events where there was greater than 20 mils of runoff only accounted for about 16 to 25% of all the runoff events. Yet these events generated 79 to 85% of the total runoff volume and 71 to 78% of the total suspended sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus loads. So we looked at these events in a little bit more detail, and it became clear that they had characteristics of having obviously really high rainfall intensities, up to and over 55 millimeters per hour, quite large rainfall amounts, so up to and over 100 mils per event, and long runoff durations of up to and over 5 hours per event. And so we think that when we get these large and intense runoff events occurring, they're likely to really mobilize and transport sediments and some nutrients, irrespective of ground cover at the time of the event, because we're seeing these loads being generated even in the main creek catchment when we had these high intensity events. So if we're thinking about land management strategies that are focused purely on increasing ground cover, we think these are likely to be most effective only during those smaller to medium-sized events. These larger events are tending to overwhelm the system. And just quickly, another somewhat unanticipated finding to come out of this work was that wet season roadworks can significantly increase sediment and nutrient concentrations and loads measured in these ephemeral streams. So these graphs are just showing sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus concentrations. And we think that wet season roadworks in the Main Creek catchment in the 2003-4 wet season really likely explain these elevated sediment and nutrient concentrations in that year. And this then translated into higher loads in the following years when we had a bit more rainfall. So obviously, if we're thinking about land management strategies that try and reduce the amounts of these sediments and nutrients entering the waterways, we need to be carefully thinking about when we implement roadwork activities. All right, so coming back to that first question of do less cows equal improved water quality? I guess the short answer is it's complicated, like most things in research. But I think what we can say from the data is that recovery of these degraded savanna rangelands is quite slow, strongly influenced by the level of management intervention applied, but also the prevailing climatic conditions. And we saw that in the Main Creek catchment, where we only really started to see any sort of recovery following that middle wet period, which was a period of above average rainfall, suggesting that we really need that rainfall to kickstart the system into recovery. And I guess this long recovery timeframes are really important to consider when we're trying to set targets for improved water quality. Just because we implement something today doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get a response immediately in the short term, at least. As I said, we think that reductions in grazing pressure alone are not likely to be sufficient to achieve the water quality targets that are currently being set. And it's likely that we're going to need to undertake some more targeted gully remediation strategies. And indeed, that's going on in various parts of the catchment, as I'll discuss in the next case study. And finally, I think an important point to come out of this work is that if we're trying to measure recovery and water quality, it really requires monitoring over long time scales to account for that climatic variability in particular. And it should also include monitoring not just of the parameters that we're interested in, so the sediment or nutrient loads, but also importantly of those other factors that could be driving that response. So things like the any changes in soil hydrological properties, or the importantly the vegetation condition, the land condition. All right, so I'm now going to move on to the second case study, which takes a closer look at some more specific gully rehabilitation measures and the effect of these measures on sediment yields being measured at the outlet of the gullies, and also the vegetation recovery. So I said that lots of different remediation measures are now and increasingly being applied right throughout the GBR catchments, but there still does actually remain fairly limited peer-reviewed literature in this space, particularly over the long term. So in this study, again, CSIRO, I was working with my colleagues at CSIRO, monitored 6 gullies between 2010 and 2018. 4 of these gullies served as untreated control gullies, and 2 of the gullies served as treatment gullies. So at treatment gully 1, the treatments included a runoff diversion structure installed near to the head of the gully, and this was designed to reduce the amount of surface runoff entering at the gully head, obviously, which is obviously driving that gully extension. In the bed of the gullies, 6 what's known as porous check dams were installed. So these are constructed from locally available material, so fallen timber, wrapped in wire and fixed into the bed of the gully. And these are designed to try and reduce the energy gradient of flow moving through that gully system to try and facilitate deposition of sediment behind the check dams, and hopefully to encourage the establishment of vegetation, which can provide that longer term stabilization. And finally, around the perimeter of the gully system was a livestock exclusion fence to try and prevent any grazing of the new biomass that may have been generated, and also prevent some destruction of the structures that were installed. In treatment gully 2, check dams and livestock exclusion fencing was also installed, but rather than a runoff diversion structure, here they undertook some pasture innovation, so ploughing out the pasture and planting it with some perennial pasture species to see if that had an effect on the amount of runoff generated. Now, a really important point here is that all of these treatments were designed to be relatively low cost without the need for any complex engineering, and they could be implemented by most graziers and most landholders in the region using equipment and tools that are available on most grazing properties. All right, so I'll jump into some of the results. So diverting surface runoff away from the gully head cuts as a result of this runoff diversion structure was found to have a substantial effect on reducing gully head cut retreat rates. So prior to the installation of this diversion structure, the heads of the gullies were retreating at a rate of about 4.3 meters squared per year, whereas after the installation of the structure, that was reduced down to about 1.2 meters squared per year. Now, it also seemed to have an effect on the actual form of erosion going on at the head cut. So rather than more deeper mass failures at the gully head, we're seeing much shallower mass failures with that failure material actually remaining in situ and in the long term revegetating, as you can see in this photograph. And that revegetation is really the key to providing that longer term gully stabilization. So it seems like these diversion structures get a big tick, but it's really important that we stress before we go and advocate this as the solution, that we really stress they can also have some unanticipated impacts. So in this study, despite the diverted runoff being diverted into an adjacently well-grassed drainage line that we thought was fairly benign, over time we did see that a new little gully was beginning to initiate. So we need to be really careful about how and where we install these structures and how they're maintained over time to prevent initiation of new gullies in other parts of the landscape. Okay, so that's the runoff diversion structures. How about these small porous check dams? So we found these are quite effective at trapping and depositing primarily coarse sediment on the gully floors, but they're less effective at trapping that fine sediment fraction. And in the context of water quality, it's really that fine sediment fraction that we're most interested in, because it's those particles that can travel the furthest and have the greatest effect on ecosystem health downstream. So to illustrate this, without porous check dams, let's just take treatment gully 1, coarse or total sediment yields was about 0.29 tons per hectare per year, whereas with porous check dams, that was reduced down to about 0.04 tons per hectare per year. Whereas in contrast, the fine sediment yields were only reduced from about 0.06 tons per hectare per year down to about 0.05 tons per hectare per year. So it's not really trapping that fine material. And I guess it's best illustrated by these few photographs, which show over time we're getting substantial deposition of that coarse material almost up to the crest of the check dam. But when we have these flow events, we're getting a lot of fine material still moving through these systems, which is indicated by this highly turbid water here. Now, while these check dams really failed to facilitate that trapping of that fine material, they were trapping substantial amounts of organic matter, and this was helping to support vegetation establishment in the bed of the gullies in the long term. So at our 2 treatment gullies where we had these check dams installed, we were getting significantly higher levels of cover and biomass in the bed of the gullies compared to the treatment gullies where there was obviously no check dams installed. So I guess we hypothesize and we think that over time, if we can continue to get increased cover and biomass behind these check dams, this will help to increase that surface roughness within the bed of the gullies, which will help to increase our actual ability to trap that fine sediment and also seeds, which obviously will then help to generate more sediment and provide that longer term gully stabilization as these check dams decay over time. All right, so some key messages out of this study. So as I said, runoff diversion structures are quite effective at reducing gully head cut erosion, but we need to be really careful about where we place these structures and how we maintain them over time to prevent initiation of new gullies. These small porous check dams were found to have a minimal effect on reducing that coarse gully sediment yields, but can still assist in that natural revegetation. I think another important point to come out of this work was that when we're undertaking these gully rehabilitation measures, they really need to be cost effective and also aligned with the management goals held by the landholders in the region. If we can demonstrate that by actually implementing these structures, which does put a bit of onus on landholders, that yes, it's not going to only have positive effects on water quality in the environment, but ultimately it can have an effect on productivity if we're managing to maintain that sediment and importantly that water in the landscape, which is what's ultimately needed for a productive sort of grazing system. But importantly, in terms of this cost, if we're thinking about cost effectiveness, the treatments that I've explained here, there may be other treatments that may be cost effective at different scales. So for example, the big alluvial gully system, which is a lot more actively eroding and has more complex sort of morphology, that will require a different set of management interventions than what's applied here. And although they might be more costly, they still may be just as cost effective if we're thinking about cost in terms of the amount of sediment that's actually reduced. And finally, it's not feasible or cost effective for every gully across all the GBR to be treated, and it's really going to require some level of prioritization. And again, that's going on, but in the next case study, I'll illustrate some of the work that we're doing to help with this prioritization process. All right, so that brings me to my third case study. And this case study is all about this concept of hydrological connectivity. So this concept of connectivity has been around in the hydrological and geomorphological literature for quite some time now, but it's increasingly being applied to examine and quantify those linkages between different parts of the landscape. So in my case, that's the linkage between a hill slope and a gully system, or that gully system to a catchment outlet or an area downstream that we might be interested in. Specifically in this work, we wanted to map really fine-scale hydrological connectivity patterns and pathways, and wanted to see if these pathways were linked to where we were seeing gully geomorphic change over time, with a view that if you could identify these pathways, it could help with that prioritization process. Now, in order to do this really fine-scale analysis, we obviously require some really high-resolution topographic and landscape data, which, as you can imagine, across the vast reef catchments is not readily available. So as part of this research, we also wanted to test the application of using these low-cost drones and handheld digital cameras to produce this information using a technique known as structure from motion with multi-view stereo photogrammetry. This technique's being used in all sorts of different contexts, but hadn't really been applied in sort of savanna rangeland landscapes, and particularly these gullied landscapes prior to this work. So just quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with structure from motion, basically it requires multiple overlapping photographic images of a scene taken from multiple viewpoints to reconstruct 3D landscape geometry. So in this work, we're using a low-cost quadcopter drone to capture images of an entire hill slope gully system spanning an area of about 15 hectares. And we use these to create these high-resolution topographic models of that hill slope system. At the same time, we also collect images on the ground using a conventional DSLR camera. And we use those images, we stitch all those images together, and we create these really high-resolution three-dimensional models of individual gully arms within that broader hill slope. Now, in addition to these sort of topographic models, we also get these high-resolution orthophotomosaics, which are really powerful for looking at some of those other land management factors that might be influencing the gullies. So in the next slide, I'll present a bit of a video that is a three-dimensional fly-through of some of the data that we generate from this, from these techniques. Unfortunately, it cuts me off, so I can't talk over it, but I'll give you a bit of a summary once it's run through. Hopefully the video plays for you. Okay, hopefully my audio's come back online now. Sorry I couldn't talk over that. It was a little glitch we found just before the presentation started, but basically it's showing the two different survey data generated from the two different survey techniques. So that broad scale map that you could see, that was generated from images from the drone. And we use those images to look at some of the catchment characteristics that might be influencing the gully. So things like the catchment area, the slope, the roughness, as well as the presence of things like roads and trails. And then you will have noted that we moved into another topographic model of that individual gully arm, which had a much higher resolution. So that was generated from images from the ground-based technique. So essentially me walking around the gully, taking a whole heap of photographs in a systematic pattern. And having that really high resolution three-dimensional sort of model is really useful to look at those fine scale morphological characteristics of the gully. It's useful for describing some of the key geomorphic processes that are driving that gully extension, and for accurately quantifying how those gullies change over time. All right, so in terms of methods for this study, so we undertook repeat drone and ground-based surveys between 2016 and 2018. And then obviously, because we're trialing a new technique, we wanted to evaluate just how accurate that data we were getting back was. We then used that data to quantify gully geomorphic change and describe some of those key within channel erosion processes. And then finally, we wanted to quantify these hydrological connectivity patterns and see if these were linked to where we're seeing geomorphic change over time. So just quickly, in terms of this hydrological connectivity, we used what's known as the index of connectivity, which has been developed to utilize these high resolution topographic models. So this index of connectivity is really strongly controlled by obviously topography, and it considers characteristics of the upstream area, which includes things like the area, the slope, as well as the surface roughness, or the things that impede flow across that landscape. And it also includes some parameters looking at the distance that a particle, for example, of water or sediment, would have to travel to arrive at its nearest target. So in this case, it's a gully, but equally it could be a catchment outlet further downstream. Right, so I mentioned that before we could use any of this data for any sort of hydrogeomorphic analysis, we needed to make sure that the data we're getting from the drone and the ground-based technique was giving us was reliable. So at the time of each survey, in addition to collecting these ground control points shown by these white boxes, these ground control points are used in the georeferencing of when we're stitching all those images together to make sure that we get good scale and everything's located correctly. So at the same time that we collect those, we collect a large number of independent RTK GPS validation points. So these are points that are not used in the processing workflow at all. And we compare the elevation of those points to those same points extracted from both our drone and ground-based DEMs, digital elevation models. And so after a fair bit of methodological trial and error and a lot of gray hairs, we're now pretty consistently getting overall elevation errors of around 9 centimeters for our drone-based stuff and about 5 centimeters for our ground-based stuff. So this is quite a high level of accuracy, quite comparable to what you can get from both airborne and terrestrial LiDAR, but obviously at a much lower cost. And it's this cost effectiveness that can really open the door to this technology and this technique being used on the ground by NRM bodies and even landholders for helping to inform how they undertake different remediation strategies, but also more generally land management, because it can give you a good idea about cover conditions to help you set stocking rates and the like. All right, so using these high resolution ground-based DEMs, we were able to quantify gully geomorphic change. So this is a couple of different gullies and showing geomorphic change over a couple of wet seasons, with red indicating erosion. So at most of our sites, we're seeing most of the erosions occurring at gully head, primarily through this mass wasting processes, but we're also getting some rilling and fluting along the gully edges and some channel bed scour. Next, using the elevation models derived from the drone, we can then map these fine-scale hydrological flow pathways. So these are shown by these yellow lines. And doing this has really enabled the spatially explicit identification of where we think gully extension is most likely to occur as a result of overland flow. At all of our study sites, the point where these flow pathways intersected our gullies corresponded to where we were seeing observed geomorphic change over time. So this is really useful from a management perspective because it really enables us to focus in on particular parts of the gullies for remediation. So for example, if all of these flow paths are intersecting at the gully head, this is really where we need to focus our efforts, and we can install something like a runoff diversion structure that I discussed earlier to try and reduce that amount of head cut retreat. Next, by overlaying these flow pathways onto these high resolution orthophoto mosaics, also derived from the drone, we can begin to look at some of those other landscape and land management factors that might be influencing the gullies. So in our work, we found that these bare and scalded areas, roads, and cattle trails are really important runoff source areas and hydrological conduits driving that gully extension. So for example, at this study site, we can see direct linkages between this unpaved road and the actively eroding gully head, which is further downstream here. And we can also clearly see how these cattle trails, which are really prolific throughout the landscapes, can capture runoff from upslope areas and reorient that flow and often lead that or funnel that directly to where we've got our existing gullies. We know that these landscape features are quite often overlooked when we're thinking about sort of broad scale catchment management in these landscapes, but we really demonstrate here that they are really important sort of hydrological conduits and should be given much greater consideration. Okay, and finally, by applying this index of connectivity, we can then clearly demarcate which parts of the hill slope are actually most connected to the gully network. So this is a map of showing connectivity, with red indicating relatively high connectivity to this gully channel and blue indicating relatively low connectivity. And as you can expect, connectivity is generally highest closest to this main channel, but progressively decreases as you move away from it. So, but across the hill slope, however, you can still see these thin lines of really high connectivity being clearly demarcated. So these are indicating the primary pathways that route water and also some fine sediment toward these gully networks. And therefore, again, where we really need to be focusing in on our remediation efforts. All right, so I've covered a lot of ground. I'm sorry if hopefully you're all still asleep, but I'll leave you with a few key take-home messages. So in this work, we've demonstrated in that first case study that recovery of these degraded rangelands is possible, but it's slow, strongly influenced by climate and the level of management intervention applied. And we really need to think carefully when we're setting targets for improved water quality about these lag times in the system. Secondly, in the second case study, we demonstrated that these runoff diversion structures, small porous check dams, and livestock exclusion fencing can all effectively reduce gully sediment yields and also help to facilitate that re-establishment of vegetation within an 8-year period. But obviously, we need to be really think really carefully about what interventions we apply depending on the particular morphology of the gullies. In the third case study, we demonstrated how we can generate high-resolution topographic and landscape information from drone and ground-based surveys, and how this information can be used and useful for land management strategies. And for example, we can use that data to map fine-scale flow pathways, connectivity patterns, and ultimately use that to inform gully management. So I'd just like to quickly acknowledge some people involved in this work, so particularly Professor Roy Seidel and Ben Jarihani, and my colleagues from the CSIRO, including Rebecca Bartley, Scott Wilkinson, Anne Henderson, and Aaron Horden. I'd also like to acknowledge the different funding bodies. So some of this work was done during my PhD, so Australian Postgraduate Awards, Meat and Livestock Australia, the CSIRO, and also the National Environmental Science Program. And finally, I'd also like to thank the landholders who hosted this research on the property, without whom it really would not have been possible. So with that, I'll stop and happy to take any questions.